Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is part 25 of Josephus's Wars. Now the siege begins. Inside the city, the two surviving tyrants, Simon and John, still command their thousands outside. Titus rides round the walls to choose his ground, and his friend Nicanor is wounded by a dart, an insult that hardens the general's resolve. The Romans raise their banks, bring up the battering rams, and after fierce sorties and single combats they break the first wall, and then the second. We meet Castor the Jew and his clever ruse, and Longinus the bold Roman, in the desperate fighting at the breaches. Let us go on.
The fighting men in the city, together with the multitude of seditious men who were with Simon, numbered 10,000, not counting the Idumeans. These 10,000 had 50 commanders, over whom Simon was supreme. The Idumeans who submitted to him numbered 5,000, and had 8 commanders. The most famous among them were Jacob the son of Soses and Simon the son of Cathlus. John, who had seized the temple, had 6,000 armed men under 20 commanders. The zealots who had come over to him and stopped opposing him numbered 2,400, and they had the same commander they had formerly had, Eleazar, together with Simon the son of Arinus. While these factions fought one another, the people were prey to both sides, as we have already said. That part of the people which would not join them in their wicked practices was plundered by both factions. Simon held the upper city, the great wall as far as Cedron, and as much of the old wall as bent from Siloam toward the east and went down to the palace of Monobazus, who was king of the Adiabni beyond Euphrates. He also held the fountain in Acrae, which was nothing other than the lower city, and all the area that reached to the palace of Queen Helena, the mother of Monobazus. John held the temple and the parts adjoining it for a long distance, as well as Ophla and the valley called the Valley of Cedron. When the parts lying between their possessions had been burned by them, they left an open space in which they could fight one another. This internal sedition did not stop even when the Romans were encamped close to their wall. Although they grew wiser for a short time after the first Roman assault on them, it lasted only a little while. They returned to their former madness, separated from one another again, fought it out, and did everything the besiegers could have wished them to do. They never suffered anything worse from the Romans than what they made each other suffer. No misery endured by the city after the actions of these men could be considered new. The city was most unhappy before it was overthrown, while those who took it actually did it a greater kindness. For I venture to affirm that the sedition destroyed the city, and the Romans destroyed the sedition, which was a much harder thing to do than to destroy the walls. Therefore we may justly ascribe our misfortunes to our own people, and the just vengeance taken on them to the Romans. As to this matter, let everyone judge from the actions of both sides. When affairs inside the city were in this condition, Titus went around the outside of the city with some chosen horsemen, looking for a proper place where he might make an impression on the walls. He was uncertain where he could attack any side, because the place was not accessible at all where the valleys lay, and on the other side the first wall appeared too strong to be shaken by engines. He therefore thought it best to make his assault near the monument of John the high priest. There the first fortification was lower, and the second was not joined to it, because the builders had neglected to build strongly where the new city was not much inhabited. Here also there was an easy passage to the third wall, through which he thought he could take the upper city, and through the tower of Antonia the temple itself. At this time, as Titus was going around the city, one of his friends named Nicanor was wounded by a dart in his left shoulder. He had approached too near the wall with Josephus, and was trying to speak to those on the wall about terms of peace, for he was known to them. When Caesar learned how violent they were, and that they would not listen even to men who came near them to persuade them toward their own preservation, he was provoked to press the siege forward. At the same time he gave his soldiers permission to set the suburbs on fire, and ordered them to bring timber together and raise banks against the city. He divided his army into 3 parts to begin these works. He placed the dart-throwers and archers in the middle of the banks that were being raised, and in front of them he set the engines that threw javelins, darts, and stones. He did this to prevent the enemy from sallying out against the works, and to stop those on the wall from obstructing them. The trees were immediately cut down, and the suburbs were left bare. While the timber was being carried to raise the banks, and the whole army was earnestly engaged in the work, the Jews were not quiet. Yet it happened that the people of Jerusalem, who had until then been plundered and murdered, now took courage. They supposed they would have a breathing space while the others were very busy opposing their enemies outside the city, and that if the Romans gained the victory they would be avenged on those who had caused their miseries. John, however, stayed behind because he feared Simon, even while his own men were eager to sally out against the enemies outside. Simon did not remain idle, for he was near the place of the siege. He brought his engines of war, and set them at proper distances on the wall, both the engines formerly taken from Cestius, and those they had obtained when they seized the garrison in the tower Antonia. Although they possessed these engines, they had so little skill in using them that they were largely useless. A few men had been taught by deserters how to use them, and they did use them, but awkwardly. They threw stones and arrows at those making the banks. They also ran out against them in companies and fought with them. Those who were working covered themselves with hurdles spread over their banks, and when the Jews made their excursions, the Roman engines opposed them. The engines that all the legions had prepared were admirably designed, but those belonging to the 10th Legion were even more extraordinary. Their dart throwers and stone throwers were more powerful and larger than the rest. With them the Romans not only repelled the Jewish sallies, but also drove away those who were on the walls. The stones they threw weighed a talent and traveled 2 furlongs and more. The blow they delivered could not be withstood, not only by those standing first in the way but also by those far beyond them. At first the Jews watched for the stone as it came, because it was white and could be detected not only by the great noise it made, but also by its brightness before it arrived. The watchmen sitting on the towers gave notice when the engine was released and the stone came from it, crying aloud in their own language, "The stone is coming." Then those in its path moved aside and threw themselves down on the ground. By guarding themselves in this way, the stone fell and did them no harm. But the Romans found a way to prevent this by blackening the stone. Then they could aim successfully because it was no longer seen beforehand, as it had been before, and in this way they destroyed many at one blow. Yet even under all this distress, the Jews did not allow the Romans to raise their banks in peace. They exerted themselves cleverly and boldly, and repelled them both by night and by day. When the Roman works were finished, the workmen measured the distance from the wall using lead and a line, which they threw from their banks. They could not measure it any other way, because the Jews would shoot at them if they came to measure it themselves. When they found that the engines could reach the wall, they brought them there. Titus then set his engines at proper distances, close enough to the wall that the Jews could not repel them, and ordered them to begin work. A tremendous noise suddenly echoed around from 3 places, and a great cry arose from the citizens inside the city. No less terror fell on the seditious themselves. Since both groups saw the common danger they were in, they planned a common defense. The men of the different factions cried out to one another that they were acting entirely in concert with their enemies, when instead, even if God did not grant them lasting harmony, they ought in their present circumstances to lay aside their enmities against one another and unite against the Romans. Accordingly, Simon publicly gave permission for those who came from the temple to go upon the wall. John also gave them the same permission, though he could not believe Simon was sincere. So both sides laid aside their hatred and private quarrels and formed one body. They ran around the walls with a great number of torches, threw them at the machines, and continually shot darts at those who drove the engines that battered the wall. The boldest among them even leaped out in groups upon the hurdles that covered the machines, tore them apart, fell upon the men who belonged to them, and beat them. They succeeded not so much by skill as chiefly by the boldness of their attacks. Titus himself kept sending help to those who were under the greatest pressure. He placed both horsemen and archers on the several sides of the engines, and by this drove off those who brought fire to them. He also repelled those who shot stones or darts from the towers, and then set the engines to work in earnest. Still the wall did not yield to these blows, except where the battering ram of the 15th Legion moved the corner of a tower. The wall itself remained unharmed, because it was not at that moment in the same danger as the tower, which projected far above it, and the fall of that part of the tower could not easily bring down any part of the wall with it. The Jews then paused their sallies for a while. But when they observed that the Romans were scattered everywhere at their works, and in their several camps, because the Romans thought the Jews had withdrawn out of weariness and fear, they suddenly made a sally at the tower Hippicus through a hidden gate. At the same time they brought fire to burn the works, and went boldly up to the Romans, even to their very fortifications. At the cry they raised, those near them immediately came to their assistance, and those farther off came running after them. Here the boldness of the Jews proved too strong for the good order of the Romans. As they beat those they first attacked, they also pressed hard upon those who had now gathered together. The fight around the machines became very fierce. One side struggled hard to set them on fire, and the other to prevent it. A confused cry rose from both sides, and many of those in the front of the battle were killed. The Jews, by their furious assaults like madmen, were now too strong for the Romans. The fire caught hold of the works, and both the works and the engines themselves would have been in danger of being burned, if many of the select soldiers from Alexandria had not stood against the attack to prevent it. They behaved with greater courage than they themselves had thought possible, and in this fight they surpassed men who had previously held a greater reputation than they did. This was the state of affairs until Caesar took the stoutest of his horsemen, and attacked the enemy. He himself killed 12 of the Jews who were in the front. When the rest of the multitude saw these men die, they gave way. Titus pursued them, drove them all into the city, and saved the works from the fire. In this fight a certain Jew was taken alive. By Titus's order he was crucified before the wall, to see whether the rest would be frightened, and would lessen their obstinacy. After the Jews had withdrawn, John, the commander of the Idumeans, was speaking before the wall with a certain soldier he knew. He was wounded by a dart shot by an Arabian and died immediately, leaving the Jews with the greatest lamentation and the seditious with sorrow. He was a man of great eminence, both for his actions and for his conduct. The next night, a surprising disturbance came over the Romans. Titus had ordered 3 towers, each 50 cubits high, to be erected, so that by placing men on them at every bank he could drive away those who were on the wall. But around midnight one of these towers fell down. Its fall made a very great noise, and fear seized the army. Thinking that the enemy was coming to attack them, they all ran to their arms. A disturbance and tumult arose among the legions. Since no one could tell what had happened, they continued in a distressed state. When no enemy appeared, they became afraid of one another, and each man urgently demanded the watchword from his neighbor, as though the Jews had invaded the camp. They were now like people under panic, until Titus was informed of what had happened and ordered everyone to be told. Then, though with some difficulty, they were freed from the disturbance they had been in. These towers were very troublesome to the Jews, who otherwise opposed the Romans very courageously. From those towers the Romans shot at them with lighter engines, and also with dart throwers, archers, and slingers. The Jews could not reach the men above them because of the towers' height. It was not practical to take the towers, or overturn them, because they were so heavy, or set them on fire, because they were covered with iron plates. So the Jews withdrew out of range of the darts, and no longer tried to hinder the impact of the rams, which, by continually beating on the wall, gradually prevailed against it. The wall already began to yield to the Nico, for that was the name the Jews themselves gave to the greatest of the Roman engines, because it conquered everything. The Jews had for a long while become weary of fighting and keeping guard, and at night they had retired to lodge at a distance from the wall. They also thought guarding the wall was unnecessary for other reasons, since 2 other fortifications still remained. Their slothfulness and the poor planning of all their councils made many of them grow lazy and withdraw. Then the Romans climbed up through the breach where Nico had made one. All the Jews left the defense of that wall and retreated to the second wall. Those who had crossed over the first wall opened the gates and received the whole army inside. In this way the Romans gained possession of the first wall on the 15th day of the siege, which was the 7th day of the month Artemisius or Jar. They demolished a large part of it, and also demolished the northern parts of the city, which had previously been demolished by Cestius. Titus now pitched his camp inside the city at the place called the Camp of the Assyrians, after seizing everything as far as Cedron, though he took care to remain out of reach of the Jews' darts. He immediately began his attacks. The Jews divided themselves into several bodies and defended that wall courageously. John and his faction defended it from the Tower of Antonia and from the northern cloister of the temple, and fought the Romans in front of the monuments of King Alexander. Simon's army took as its share the ground near John's monument and fortified it, as far as the gate where water was brought into the Tower Hippicus. The Jews made violent sallies and frequently, in groups out of the gates, and there they fought the Romans. When they were all pursued back to the wall, they were defeated in those fights because they lacked the skill of the Romans. But when they fought from the walls, they were too hard for them. The Romans were encouraged by their power joined to their skill, while the Jews were encouraged by their boldness, which was fed by fear, and by that hardiness natural to our nation under calamities. They were also encouraged by hope of deliverance, just as the Romans were encouraged by their hope of subduing them in a short time. Neither side grew weary. Attacks and fighting at the wall, and constant group sallies, continued all day long. There was no kind of military engagement that was not then used. Night itself had difficulty separating them after they had begun fighting in the morning. Indeed, the night itself passed without sleep on both sides, and was more uneasy for them than the day. One side feared that the wall would be taken, and the other feared that the Jews would make sallies upon their camps. Both sides slept in their armor during the night, so that at the first appearance of light they were ready for battle. Among the Jews there was ambition over who would be the first to face danger, and thereby please their commanders. Above all, they held Simon in great reverence and dread. Every one of those under him regarded him so strongly that, at his command, they were fully ready to kill themselves with their own hands. What made the Romans courageous was their usual habit of conquering, their unfamiliarity with defeat, their constant wars, their continual military exercises, and the grandeur of their dominion. Their chief encouragement now was Titus, who was present everywhere with them all. It seemed a terrible thing to grow weary while Caesar was there, fighting bravely just as they did, and being both an eyewitness of those who behaved valiantly and the one who would reward them. It was also considered a present advantage for any man's valor to become known to Caesar. For this reason many showed more eagerness than their actual strength could support. At about this time, while the Jews stood in a strong body in battle order before the wall, and while both sides were throwing darts at one another, Longinus, a man of the equestrian order, leaped out from the Roman army into the very middle of the Jewish army. When they scattered at his attack, he killed 2 of their bravest men. One he struck in the mouth as the man came to meet him. The other he killed with the same dart that he pulled out of the first man's body, running him through the side as he fled. After doing this, he was the first to run out from the middle of his enemies back to his own side. This man distinguished himself by his valor, and many others became eager to gain a similar reputation. The Jews were unconcerned about what they themselves suffered from the Romans, and cared only about what harm they could do them. Death itself seemed a small matter to them, if only they could at the same time kill one of their enemies. But Titus took care both to protect his own soldiers from harm, and to have them overcome their enemies. He said that inconsiderate violence was madness, and that true courage was the courage joined with good conduct. He therefore ordered his men, when fighting their enemies, to take care that they received no harm from them at the same time, and in this way to show themselves truly valiant. Titus now brought one of his engines to the middle tower on the north part of the wall. In this tower a crafty Jew named Castor lay in ambush, with 10 others like himself, the rest having fled because of the archers. These men lay still for a while under their breastplates, as if in great fear. But when the tower was shaken, they rose up. Castor then stretched out his hand like a petitioner, called for Caesar, moved him to compassion by his voice, and begged him to have mercy on them. Titus, in the innocence of his heart, believed Castor was sincere, and hoped the Jews were now repenting. He stopped the battering ram, forbade anyone to shoot at the petitioners, and told Castor to say whatever he wished to say. "I will come down, if you will give me your right hand as security." Titus replied that he was pleased with such agreeable conduct, and would be pleased if all the Jews were of the same mind, and that he was ready to give the same security to the city. 5 of the 10 men pretended along with Castor and seemed to beg for mercy, while the rest cried aloud that they would never be slaves to the Romans while it was still in their power to die in freedom. While these men spent a long time quarreling, the attack was delayed. Castor also sent word to Simon, telling him that they could take some time for consultation about what should be done, because he would deceive the power of the Romans for a considerable while. At the same time that he sent this message, he openly appeared to exhort those who were obstinate to accept Titus's hand as security. But they seemed very angry at this. They brandished their bare swords over the breastworks, struck themselves on the breast, and fell down as if they had been killed. Titus and those with him were amazed at the courage of the men. Since they could not see exactly what was happening, they admired their great fortitude and pitied their calamity. During this interval, someone shot a dart at Castor and wounded him in the nose. Castor immediately pulled out the dart, showed it to Titus, and complained that this was unfair treatment. Caesar rebuked the man who had shot the dart and sent Josephus, who was standing by him, to give Castor his right hand. But Josephus said he would not go to him, because these pretended petitioners intended nothing good. He also restrained his friends who were eager to go. Still, there was one Ennius, a deserter, who said he would go to him. Castor then called out that someone should come and receive the money he had with him. This made Ennius run toward him even more eagerly, with his bosom open. Castor picked up a large stone and threw it at him. It missed Ennius because he guarded himself against it, but it wounded another soldier who was coming toward him. When Caesar understood that this was a deception, he realized that mercy in war is a harmful thing, because such cunning tricks have less room to operate when greater severity is used. Angered by the deceit practiced on him, he made the engine work more strongly than before. But when the tower began to give way, Castor and his companions set it on fire and leaped through the flame into a hidden vault beneath it. This made the Romans suppose even more that they were men of great courage, as if they had thrown themselves into the fire. Caesar took this wall on the 5th day after he had taken the first. When the Jews fled from him, he entered through it with 1,000 armed men, chosen from his select troops. He came in at a place where the wool merchants, the braziers, and the cloth market were, and where the narrow streets ran obliquely toward the wall. If Titus had immediately demolished a larger part of the wall, or had entered, and according to the law of war, laid waste what remained, I suppose his victory would not have been mixed with any loss to himself. But he hoped to make the Jews ashamed of their obstinacy by showing that, though he was able to afflict them more, he was not willing to do more than was necessary. Therefore he did not widen the breach in the wall to make a safer retreat, if one became necessary, for he did not think they would set snares for a man who was treating them with such kindness. When he came in, he did not allow his soldiers to kill any of those they caught, nor to set fire to their houses. He even gave the seditious men permission, if they wished, to fight without bringing harm on the people, and promised to restore the people's possessions to them. He was very eager to preserve the city for his own sake, and the temple for the sake of the city. The people had long been ready to accept his proposals. But to the fighting men, this humanity appeared to be a sign of weakness. They imagined that he made these offers because he was unable to take the rest of the city. The fighting men threatened death to any of the people who should say a single word about surrender. They cut the throats of those who spoke of peace, and then attacked the Romans who had come inside the wall. Some they met in the narrow streets, and others they fought from their houses. At the same time, they made a sudden sally from the upper gates and assaulted the Romans who were beyond the wall, until those guarding the wall were so frightened that they leaped down from their towers and withdrew to their several camps. A great noise then arose from the Romans inside, because they were surrounded on every side by their enemies, and also from those outside, because they feared for the men left in the city. The Jews grew continually more numerous and had great advantages over the Romans because they knew those narrow lanes completely. They wounded many of them, fell upon them, and drove them out of the city. For the moment, the Romans were forced to make the best resistance they could, because they could not get out in large numbers through the breach in the wall, since it was so narrow. It is likely that all who had gotten inside would have been cut to pieces if Titus had not sent help. He ordered the archers to stand at the upper ends of these narrow lanes, and he himself stood where the greatest multitude of enemies was gathered. With his darts he checked them, as did Domitius Sabinus with him, a valiant man who showed himself to be such in this battle. Caesar continued shooting darts at the Jews without pause, preventing them from coming upon his men, until all his soldiers had retreated out of the city. In this way the Romans were driven out after they had taken possession of the second wall. The fighting men in the city were lifted up in spirit and exalted by this success. They began to think that the Romans would never dare to come into the city again, and that if they themselves stayed inside it, they would no longer be conquered. for God had blinded their minds because of the transgressions they had committed. They could not see how much greater the Roman forces were than those now expelled, any more than they could perceive how famine was creeping upon them. Until then, they had fed themselves from the public miseries and drunk the blood of the city. But poverty had long since seized the better part of the people, and many had already died from lack of necessities. The seditious, however, thought the destruction of the people was a relief to themselves. They wanted no one preserved except those who opposed peace with the Romans, and were resolved to live in opposition to them. They were pleased when the multitude of those with the opposite opinion was consumed, because they were then freed from a heavy burden. This was their state of mind toward those inside the city. They covered themselves with their armor and prevented the Romans when they tried to enter the city again. They made a wall of their own bodies opposite the part of the wall that had been thrown down. In this way they defended themselves valiantly for 3 days. But on the 4th day they could not withstand the violent assaults of Titus, and they were forced to flee to the same place where they had fled before. So Titus quietly took possession of that wall again and demolished it completely. After he put a garrison in the towers on the southern parts of the city, he considered how he might assault the 3rd wall.
And there we leave the Romans inside the 2nd wall and the 3rd still before them. Next time, in part 26, Titus relaxes the siege to offer terms, and sends Josephus himself to plead with his own countrymen from beneath the walls. The deserters slip out by night, and the first horrors of the famine take hold within. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.